Well, Tom, I've invited you on this show for a very serious conversation about the topic of humor. I'm not sure if that really makes sense or not to have a serious conversation about humor, but one of the reasons that I've invited you is because you have written a book recently, and it's entitled It's Okay to Laugh in Church, subtitle An Unofficial Book of Parish Wit and Humor. I must say I do not find all the material in this book terribly funny, but perhaps you could hold it up now and people could take a look at this book and and see if they are impressed with it. What do you want to say about this book that you've written here?
Well, first I would remind you we're not on television. I can't hold it up. You've always had that difficulty
that was a
distinguishing
joke, Tom.
between radio and television. But I'm glad that you liked some of the stories anyway, Jim, in the book.
Well, I think that it does raise some serious questions, because a lot of people would say, well, humor has no place in religious matters or in theological circles or in church. And I think that I would like to set a little bit of framework by saying I would disagree with that and think that humor is actually quite helpful in understanding ourselves and our relationship with God. One of the primary problems in life, it seems to me, is that we end up taking ourselves too seriously. That is, we make more of ourselves and our condition than is warranted. One way we do that, it seems to me, is trying to make ourselves into God. And what humor helps us to do, I think, especially the self-deprecating style, is to recognize our limitations, to recognize that not everything about ourselves is of ultimate significance or concern, that we were really in relationship to one whom we call our God and the great mystery that runs our lives. So I was going to suggest a first point as we think about this is that really humor helps to locate ourselves. It helps us to see who we are in relationship to the cosmos, and helps to get rid of some of that pretentiousness, I think, that a lot of us find very unattractive. You find in the material you've put together for the book that sort of thing comes out, or did you...
I think that's good. Yeah, I think it does tend to humor, real humor, the kind of humor which, as you suggest, implies the fact that we aren't in control, that God is in control. The kind of humor that recognizes that there is a power above our own egos, which I might say it reminds me sometimes of the first commandment: "Thou shalt not have strange gods before me." And sometimes the strangest god that we put in front of the Creator is our own ego, as you suggest. And one way to simply say God, just to say thank you to God for the gift of life and all of its uncertainties and unpredictabilities, and to acknowledge the fact that we are not in control, that there is a power far beyond our own little desires and plans and so forth, is to laugh. Not to laugh down at somebody, but to simply to laugh in the sense of lightheartedness, in the way, for example, some of the great saints, Philip, whom I think of? Philip, one of the great saints.
I don't know who you
think of it in a minute.
Saint Philip Neri.
That's
maybe.
It. I knew if I said Philip, you would fill in the last name immediately. And I mean, you and I might say in a more serious vein that when we talk about humor, I often, in a theological sense, I'm often reminded of your fine work, Apologetics and the Eclipse of Mirth.
Tom, that book is Apologetics and the Eclipse of Mystery.
Yeah. I thought it was apologetics. Well, isn't it 6 in one, half dozen in the other?
Mirth and mystery. I think you're getting confused here, but that's all right. Now, I was thinking about, you were talking about saints able to muster this sort of thing, but it's not just saints. I'm contrasting in my own mind President Reagan and President Carter on this business of self-deprecating humor. If you remember when President Reagan got shot, his comment afterwards, which was so superb, was, "I forgot to duck." In the midst of this terrible situation, in this assassination attempt, the man kept somehow a sense of perspective, and that, I think, just made him more appealing to the citizenry as a whole. By contrast, I was thinking of President Carter when he was not able to master this light touch when he was commenting on an attack by a giant rabbit while he was out in a boat. Do you remember that? This giant rabbit had attacked, and it became a serious matter. Well, then the humor came.
I thought it was a giant elephant.
No, it was a giant rabbit. That was made the point of the humor. Well, the pundits afterwards had a field day with that sort of thing. The president had picked up an oar and fended off this terrible rabbit that was attacking them. So I think that it's an example of self-deprecating humor, and it connects in with this sense of not taking oneself too seriously. And what happens, I think, when we do, often that ends up making it more difficult for us to relate to people or for them to relate to us. I think maybe often clergy are guilty of this, a certain arrogance or self-righteousness, an inability to laugh at self, to take oneself too seriously. And when that happens, the movies and television or jokesters, comedians love to make fun of that sort of thing. I must say that it's probably not only clergy who are subject to that, but I've known lawyers who have adopted that same posture and unable to have any sense of self-deprecating humor.
Well, I think that's right. I think that if you lack a sense of self-deprecating humor, it's easy to be suspicious that you may take yourself not only too seriously, but you may think that you're far more important than you are. And I think that people sense that in people who are too grave, too serious, who seem puffed up and important. And I think that does inspire distrust. Your point about Carter and Reagan, I think, is well taken. I think that had Jimmy Carter, for example, come out after that incident with, you say it was a rabbit?
Yeah,
had he come out and said, that rabbit was so large, I mistook it for an elephant. You see, people would have associated that with an attack by the Republicans on himself.
Very good.
I used that.
You're not going to make it as a stand-up comedian, but it's not too bad.
Well, I wasn't trying to be funny. I was trying to use a down-to-earth example. But had Carter, come to the press and said, "Look, the thing was so big, I mistook it for an elephant, and that's why I beat it off with the oar," people would have appreciated that. And I think if you look through history, you can see that what happens when leaders lack a sense of humor. If you look at the leaders who have succeeded in leading nations in history, you will find almost invariably those who come to a bad end were totally self-absorbed, and literally elevated their ideology or the ideology for which they stood.
And the person who leaps to mind is Lenin.
Hitler.
I bet you had him in mind. Yeah.
Lenin, Hitler,
Stalin.
Self-absorbed.
That's a good word.
Self-absorbed. Totally absorbed in themselves. Now you take someone like Churchill, had a marvelous sense of humor, and used it appropriately. I can think of, for example, there's a story, maybe apocryphal, maybe true, of one evening when Churchill was at a meeting in the House of Commons. He was in a cloakroom or something, and they were having cocktails, and as he was known to do, he had a few cocktails too many and became a little bit unsteady. And as he was leaving, according to the story, as he was leaving the room, he bumped into a woman and knocked her down. And the woman looked at him and said, "Mr. Churchill, you are drunk." And he looked back at her and he said, "And you, madam, are ugly. The difference is tomorrow morning I will be sober."
That's good. Well said.
But that kind of wit and humor was used by Churchill again and again and again to make points, to inspire the confidence of his people.
Tom, let me give you a little quote here from my mentor, Karl Rahner. Very sober and serious man, if I've ever met one. Great theologian of our time. But he did have that sense of humor. In fact, when I was with him in gatherings, he he never wanted to be the center of attention on theological conversation. In fact, he didn't like to have me sit next to him at meals because I would try to ask him these difficult questions, theological questions, which he didn't want to deal with, and because he didn't want to be the center of attention. And yet very often in conversation he would come up with some little pointed remark, often a very earthy kind of statement that lightened up the whole scene. But here's what Rahner says about humor. He says, not everybody has a sense of humor. Well, I mean, I think we can go along with that. Some people have great trouble with it. He says that having a sense of humor calls for an altruistic detachment from oneself and a mysterious sympathy with others, which is felt even before they open their mouths. Now, there's an element we haven't gotten in here yet. That is not a detachment from self, but a mysterious sympathy with others. You notice that? I find that to be an interesting phrase there. That there's I think the good comedians have that. The good comedians are able to empathize with the human scene. They have a feel for people, and that comes out. Then he goes on and he continues. He says, a good laugh is a sign of love. It may be said to give us a glimpse of or a first lesson in the love that God bears for every one of us. Now that begins, he opens this up. It's the idea that humor is pointing us to the divine. A good laugh is a sign of love, and it's a lesson, he says, in the love that God bears for every one of us. Goes on, God laughs, says the Bible. And when the last piece of human folly makes the last burst of human laughter ring out crisp and clear in a doomed world, is it too much to imagine that this laugh will resemble that of God and seem to convey that in spite of everything, all's well? Mm-hmm. I think of that idea of despite of everything, all is well. I remember when my father died, and there was a lot of humor connected with that. We used humor a lot to get through that. I remember when we went to the funeral home and we were pricing expensive coffins, something my father would have never wanted to happen. And we had a lot of laughter and humor going around that. What would Dad think now, looking at this coffin that cost this much money, or he wouldn't abide this. And it really, the humor helped us to get through all of that. And so I think that's one of the things that Rahner is saying here, seem to convey that in spite of everything, all's well. It's okay with the universe.
I like that. And I think one way to look at what Rahner is saying is that when we laugh, and that laughter is a reflection of a deep sense of the ultimate mystery of life. The inscrutable nature of creation, with all of its uncertainties, its incongruities, with all of the problems that we face in life, all the difficulties we face in life. When we laugh in a way, when we laugh from the heart, in recognition of the what Rahner calls the gracious mystery, we are in effect uttering a prayer. It's a prayer of adoration. It's a prayer of acceptance. And I think that's one way to look at the kind of laughter that Rahner is describing. A laughter from the heart, which involves a surrender to the mystery of life, can be viewed as a form of prayer in the sense that it is a bowing down and an acceptance of the fact that we aren't in control, that life is filled with mysteries that we can't begin to answer. And that it seems to me a great deal of prayer, and it takes a cultivation of faith and hope in the ultimate mercy and graciousness of God to do that. And I think what Rahner is describing, in a sense, can be described as the kind of deep sense of the goodness and the benevolence of life which prayerful people like Rahner develop in their lives as a result of hard discipline, as a result of finding it within them through prayer and meditation and through their living out of their faith. They come to the point where they're able to write beautiful thoughts like that because they live them day in and day out.
I think that's right. I think I liked what you said. It flows out of the heart.
Flows out of the heart.
A deep-seated sense of things.
Faith-filled, I think, is in other words. And I think that we have to make a distinction between that kind of laughter, which is a reflection of humility, and the kind of laugh that comes, for example, from joke telling that has little point or is in bad taste or is designed to put down other people.
Yeah, let's stay with that for a moment there. I think that's right, because a lot of what we associate with humor these days is put-down humor.
Put-down humor.
It's hard to know quite what to make of that. I mean, we have the ethnic jokes that people make, and one wonders what's behind that, I suppose. Or we have another phenomenon that we call the roast. And oftentimes people do get a kick out of that sort of thing. Now, I think we got to distinguish here, in other words. Just because humor has a put-down character to it does not mean that it is offensive. Now, let's take the roast. I mean, everyone knows the rules of the game there, right? People are to put the person who's being honored down, in a way. It's a subtle form of praise, really. And we've all gathered for this reason. We recognize this person's importance, and the humor connected with it has another message. I would suggest that what's different is context. Sometimes you're in a setting when people tell a joke, an ethnic joke or a joke to put somebody down. The context tells you there's something wrong with it, that it is meant not to lighten the situation or as subtle praise of the other person, but it's really meant to put that other person down, or that group, or that particular ethnic group. And so I would think that you can't just blanket say jokes at the expense of other people somehow are wrong or unhealthy.
No, I didn't mean to suggest that all jokes at the expense of the other person would be unhealthy. But I think that there is a line, and I think that line is in the heart, and I think it's very difficult not to sense humor which ultimately is cynical or is meant to derogate another person or to denigrate another person's standing or whatever, and the kind of humor which essentially pokes fair and gracious fun at the human condition and at our human foible. So if you take somebody, for example, at a roast, who is being roasted in good spirit and in good taste, I would say that's perfectly proper. It simply is a way of acknowledging implicitly, as you suggest, the basic humility of that person. After all, if that person were an egomaniacal SOB, he or she probably wouldn't be roasted in the first place. And the mere fact the person is important enough to be roasted says something about the fact that he or her, his or her fellow human beings sees that that person has many qualities and accomplishments worth honoring.
It gets back to that thing that Ronner was talking about, that humor has a basis in a mysterious sympathy with others. Maybe we would use the word empathy these days rather than sympathy, but a mysterious empathy with other people, that sensing the commonness of the human situation. I think that's one of the things that makes the power of humor very often, is that it brings us together. When I think we have a lot of kidding about male bonding and so on, but a lot of times when we're together on the golf course or at athletic events or so on, there's certain humor that is used that it does bring people together, and the stories will be told over and over of remember on the basketball court, remember he threw him the pass in the corner and it dribbled out of bounds and he dove for it. I mean, we remember the stories, and they have a humorous content to them, and there's sort of a binding power and all. And I didn't mean to say that's strictly only a male thing, but it probably the content would be different. You could probably find women telling jokes as well about other aspects of their life that they've participated in. Mm-hmm. So that's part of that creature feeling, that sense that it brings us together, helps form a community. Usually a group that can laugh together in a healthy way, I suppose, begins to move towards becoming a community of shared interest and of an empathy for one another.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. I think that when we're together and we laugh together, I think there is a sense of a shared humanity, of a shared suffering, of shared struggle, and that's why I think that when a group of people, professional people or like-minded people, get together and They not only share knowledge, but they share their view of life, including their sense of the humorous in life. I think it does bind people together in strange and mysterious ways, as I think Ronner's comment implies.
I'm going to go back to this other thing about really a question of that humor puts us in proper context, that it's an understanding that we live in a mysterious part of life, that it's not possible to solve all of life's problems and so on. There's a well-known thinker by the name of W. Allen who said this one time about the great questions. He says, humankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness. The other to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly.
I like it. There's a lot in that.
Of course. And this is W. Allen, of course, is Woody Allen, who makes news in other ways, and who's not merely a theologian, but also makes movies and so on.
Yes.
So that, I like that. He's got all kind of wonderful things like that. There's another one that Woody Allen comes to mind. He was talking about Jesus, and of course, Allen is of Jewish background, as I got it. He says Jesus was extremely well adjusted for an only child. Now, I mean, I suppose some people could get upset about that, a Jewish person saying that about Christ, who we say is the Son of God and so on. But I think it brings into the religious realm this other, idea of the sense of humor, and one could see that, I think, in a healthy way.
Well, I would respond to that by pointing out that I knew when I made the comment about your book that the title of your book was Apologetics and the Eclipse of Mystery.
Yes, you're one of the few people who has really read it carefully, as a matter of fact.
But one of the points in your book, I think, is the fact that you can elevate the rational faculty, the intellect, to the point where it extinguishes the mystery of life. It distinguishes it, and I think that's a point that I made a little earlier about what happens when reason alone takes over. It's very easy for man to build artificial castles, like Lenin's communist system, for example, which begot Stalin, one of the most despotic, psychopathic killers in history. And it seems to me that we look at the systems, these false gods that were put up, Nazism, communism, and so forth. What ultimately happened is that the inner logic of those systems simply reached a point where it could no longer inspire the people. There was nothing there beyond the inner logic, the rational logic of that system, for their leaders to use to inspire people. And if you can't inspire, you can't lead. So ultimately, these were doomed systems from the beginning because they elevated themselves to the systems. The ideology became literally godlike in status within the political systems that these leaders managed to create, and ultimately fell of its own weight. And I think that's the idea behind the theme behind apologetics and the eclipse of mystery. The eclipse of
you got it right.
Of mystery.
Yes, right. And, we're trying to stay away from. We're trying to distinguish mirth
from mystery.
And mystery.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. We are. And so when I said apologetics and the eclipse of mirth, 6 in one, half dozen in the other, I was trying to imply that point that I just said at some length.
And I think a point that I would end up agreeing with. I think I would end up agreeing with that. Yeah, the elevation of the rational faculty, which ends up, as Chesterton says, means you lose everything then except your mind.
But
you've lost. You've
God
lost.
Spare me from everyone who's. God help us. What do you say? Spare us from the person who's lost everything but reason. Save us from the person who's lost everything but reason.
I think there's a more practical sort of use of humor very often to lighten up situations. I remember working on a committee with a bishop who was very good at this, and we had worked together for about 3 years. We met, over and over, hour-long meetings, and just difficult things. That's when we were writing the pastoral letter on campus ministry, and the bishop was just wonderful because as he was sort of a southern, down-home kind of thing. And when the tension got the worst, he would have some silly joke to tell or some bit of humor, and it really lightened up the whole thing. And I think that's another way in which we think of humor. We can use it effectively very often to make the situation a little lighter and easier to deal with.
Oh, sure. And isn't it wonderful when we're together at a banquet or at a meeting of some kind and somebody begins with an anecdote that lightens everything up? Isn't it? It's wonderful. It's almost miraculous how a speaker who understands humor can create exactly the right mood in an audience and thereby greatly enhance the power of whatever message he or she may be there to deliver.
Mm-hmm. Well, Tom, we've been talking here about the whole idea of humor, and I've tried to I've slanted it towards a theological kind of approach. And we've moved in the direction of saying that humor can teach us a whole lot of things about life. I think that the one major point I got from one of your comments was that we ought not to be self-absorbed. To be self-absorbed like the great dictators in history is really destructive, and that we need to lighten up, in a sense, and have a little bit of self-deprecating humor. That often helps. Then we tried to see that, indeed, humor brings us into a sort of creaturely feeling, that it creates friendship, it bonds us together, we know the human struggles. And then finally, that humor relates us to the divine, to the one we call the mystery, reminds us that of our own finiteness, and that this God who Rahner says is a God who laughs, quoting the psalm, God laughs, and that enables us to deal better and more effectively with the difficulties of life.